Hello, my name is Damian Juka, and today I'll be talking about the comparison in suicide rates and how high suicide rates are dealt with across three countries: South Africa, Japan, and the United States. Beginning with South Africa, they have a population of 60 million people, and South Africa is located on the southernmost tip of the continent of Africa. Of their 60 million people, 18.2 million of those people are living in extreme poverty, and racial disparity has been an issue in the country for a very long time. South Africa's public healthcare system is a mix of public and private healthcare, but generally only people who are better off and rich people can afford the private healthcare. The rest have to go with the public healthcare, which is certainly much less quality than the private healthcare is. As a nation, they spend 9.11% of their total GDP on healthcare, which is lower than in the United States and Japan. South Africa has one of the highest suicide rates in the world at 23.5 suicides per 100,000 citizens. Recently, South Africa has seen a rise in the prevalence of depression, up to 9.7% of the population having dealt with or are currently dealing with depression. In South Africa, there is a certain stigma towards mental health and suicide, as there is in many other countries. But unlike more developed countries, this stigma has lasted and persisted. So it is often an ignored topic or kind of taboo to talk about in South Africa. Luckily, there is a group called the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, which does their best to provide the mental health care that developed countries have, such as providing a suicide hotline that fielded over 600 calls a day before COVID and now fields over 2,000 calls per day. South Africa does not have the same resources that the United States and Japan have, so this group is one of their only forms of suicide prevention. Along with the call center and support that they provide, they also provide training on suicide prevention to schools, communities, employers, and parents to teach their workers or students or children about reaching out for help and dealing with these mental illnesses and suicidal thoughts. Despite all this, South Africa still sees 23 suicides and 460 suicide attempts per day. On the map, you can see that South Africa has a pretty high suicide rate compared to other countries, and not only compared to developed countries, but compared to underdeveloped countries as well. And this graph shows the total suicides at 23.5 per 100,000, and it also shows the disparity between male suicides and female suicides, as male suicides are much higher. Japan has a population of 125 million people and is located in the Pacific Ocean off the coasts of Russia and China. Japan has a relatively high poverty rate of 15.7, which is high among most developed countries, but they also have one of the highest life expectancies in the world at 85.03 years on average. Japan has a universal healthcare plan which covers 98.3% of their citizens, while other public programs cover the other 1.7%. Japan has a very good healthcare system that covers 100% of their population, and they spend about 11% of their $5.38 trillion GDP on healthcare. Japan provides excellent mental health care, which includes outpatient, inpatient, and home care with a range of services that are available to the public, like tests, therapy, medication, and rehabilitation. But despite all this, Japan still has a relatively high suicide rate at 16.8 suicides per 100,000 citizens. Although this number is much less than South Africa, it is still unusually high for a developed nation. Their suicide rate is just below the United States, but if you look at the group of 7 developed countries, which are the main developed countries in the world, Japan has the second highest suicide rate among those countries. They offer excellent mental health care facilities, and along with that, they also, like the United States and South Africa, have a suicide hotline that is running 24/7 for anybody that's having suicidal feelings or thoughts. And most prominently, the Japanese government announced a plan in 2017 to be put into action to try and reduce the suicide rate in the country by 30% over the next decade. Their suicide rate, when it was launched, was around 18.5 suicides per 100,000 citizens, and they hope to reduce that rate to 13 suicides per 100,000 by the year 2025. This program offers adequate mental health treatment while also limiting employee overwork and addressing certain issues such as teen suicide and postpartum depression in new mothers. Japan has a relatively high suicide rate for developed countries. If you look at the map, they're in the yellow category, and looking at the graph on the left, you can see that Japan's suicide rate was much higher in 2012, but has since gone down, although in the last 2 years, the suicide rate has gone up slightly. They are hoping to lower it drastically by the year 2025. Finally, the United States has a population of 330 million people. The United States uses a mixed public health system, which includes both public and private insurers that are both nonprofit and for-profit. There is no universal health care in the United States, but there are programs that allow disadvantaged people like elderly, people living in poverty, and disabled people to receive health care. These programs include Medicaid, which covers 19% of the U.S. population, and Medicare, which covers 18% of the population. Private insurance is the dominant form of coverage in the United States, covering 67% of the population. The United States spends the most amount of money on their healthcare compared to not only the other countries that I'm looking at, but any other country in the world. They have a GDP of over 20 trillion and 19.7% of it is spent on healthcare. And despite all the money that is dumped into the U.S. healthcare system, it generally ranks lower than that of other developed countries such as Japan. The United States currently has a suicide rate of around 13.42 suicides per 100,000 citizens, which is the lowest of any of the countries that I'm looking at here. It's still relatively high compared to other developed nations. And if you look at the map, see that a lot of the suicides are focused in the Great Plains area of the United States, in Montana and Wyoming, where they have over a 20 suicide rate per 100,000 citizens. To combat these high rates, the U.S. has launched many different programs and strategies, including, like South Africa and Japan, a suicide hotline that is available 24/7 to support anybody who is having suicidal thoughts or feelings. The United States Suicide Hotline began operating in 2005, and it has fielded over 2.5 million calls in 2021 alone. Overall, since 2005, the United States Suicide Hotline has received over 23 million calls. The U.S. is especially emphasizing a reduction in suicide rate, as there has been a 30% increase in suicide rate since 2000 in the United States. The government began prioritizing access to mental health care facilities in both public and private settings, and they've also launched countless ad campaigns to lessen the stigma around the topic of mental health and suicide and convince people that it is okay to reach out for help with mental illness and suicide. So far, there is still a stigma around the topic, like many other countries, but ad campaigns and other programs have done a lot to lessen that. This graph shows, just like most other countries, that the rate of male suicides is much higher than the rate of female suicides, and this is the same in both Japan and South Africa. Looking at all three of these countries, they all have a relatively high suicide rate. United States and Japan is high compared to other developed nations, and South Africa is certainly the highest, with one of the highest suicide rates in the world. This makes sense because South Africa does not have the same resources that countries like Japan and the United States have access to, and many of the people living in less privileged areas of South Africa, especially a lot of the black population living in South Africa, do not have the access to mental health care and the facilities that they need. All three countries have kind of similar ways of dealing with suicide, with the suicide hotline being universal across all three of these countries, as well as different programs trying to give less privileged people access to mental health care facilities. The United States and Japan, these programs are government funded and have the money that they need, whereas in South Africa, their prevention programs may only be funded by small groups like the South African Anxiety and Depression Group, so they might not have the resources that they're looking for. Luckily, all three of these countries have recently seen slight drops in suicide rate over the last 5 to 10 years. Although Japan is seeing a slight increase, South Africa and the United States have seen decreases in the last 2 years and overall decreases in the last 10 years, and hopefully this trend will continue this way.